Hello, my name is Wyatt Dawson. I'm 35 years old, and if you ask me about my life's journey, I'd say it began in the sun-soaked summer days of Norfolk, Virginia, alongside my grandfather, the man who shaped who I am today. I'm not just the founder of Arthur's Legacy Steakhouse chain, but also someone who carries a burning legacy within me, a legacy left by my grandfather, Arthur Dawson. Not only through blood, but through lessons etched deep into my heart. I grew up in a small town where the salty scent of the Chesapeake Bay mingled with the smoky aroma of the wood-fired grill at the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar, the family restaurant my grandfather built from scratch. That was my home, where my childhood memories brimmed with days spent wandering with him, from oak-lined streets to bustling farmers' markets. Every early morning before the sun had fully risen, I'd sit in the back of his old pickup truck, listening to the crackling radio playing classic country tunes. He'd hum along, his voice warm and deep, and I, just a kid, would sit there, eyes wide with awe, looking at him like he was a hero. My grandfather, Arthur, wasn't the type to boast. He was tall, with silver hair, but his deep blue eyes always shone with resolve. He once told me, "Wyatt, business isn't just about making money. It's about how you treat the people around you. From the farmer who grows your vegetables to the customer sitting at your table. Reputation is something you can't buy, but once lost, you can never get it back." I was too young to fully grasp those words, but they were like seeds planted in my heart, waiting to sprout. During those summer days, I'd tag along with him to the farmer's market. He never bought ingredients from big suppliers. "They only care about money, Wyatt," he'd say. "But these farmers, they pour their sweat into every vegetable, every fish. They deserve respect." I still remember him standing in the sunlight wearing a faded plaid shirt, shaking hands with each farmer, asking about their crops, their families. Once, a farmer named Joe, who grew the sweetest sweet potatoes in the area, shared that his harvest had been ruined by floods. Without hesitation, my grandfather bought his entire remaining stock, knowing the restaurant wouldn't use it all. "Sometimes, Wyatt, helping others is helping yourself," he said, patting my shoulder. I loved those mornings. They weren't just trips to the market. They were living lessons. He taught me how to pick ripe tomatoes, how to smell fresh fish to know it was just caught, or how to look into a seller's eyes to see their sincerity. "Look them in the eye, Wyatt," he'd say. "If they can't meet your gaze, don't trust them." I'd nod, half understanding, but in my mind I was just thrilled to be on an adventure with my hero. His restaurant, the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar, was the heart of our family. It wasn't just how we made a living. It was what brought people together. Customers didn't come just to eat. They came to talk, to share everyday stories. Some had been dining there since the day it opened, calling him Art with affection. I remember busy evenings when the restaurant was packed, filled with laughter and the clinking of cutlery. My grandfather was everywhere, pouring beer at the bar, checking ribs in the kitchen, or chatting with customers. I, an 8-year-old kid, would sit at the corner of the counter, sipping soda and watching him. I wanted to grow up to be like him, strong, dependable, and loved by all. But things weren't always perfect. He told me about the tough early days. He opened the restaurant in the 70s during hard economic times when no one believed a man without a college degree could succeed. He borrowed money from everyone he knew, worked day and night, sometimes sleeping on the kitchen floor to save time. "But Wyatt," he'd say, his eyes gleaming, "when you believe in what you do, when you put your whole heart into it, nothing is impossible." His words made my heart race, as if he was passing his fire to me. Those lessons weren't just words. I saw how he treated his staff, from waiters to dishwashers, like family. Once an employee named Maria fell seriously ill and couldn't work for a month. He not only kept paying her salary, but also visited her in the hospital with a basket of fruit and a handwritten card. When I asked why he did it, he said, "We're a family, and family doesn't abandon each other." I was closer to my grandfather than anyone else in the family. My father, Frank, was always busy with his own projects, rarely showing up at the restaurant. My twin brother Blake preferred playing over caring about the family business. So I became my grandfather's shadow, following him everywhere, soaking up every lesson. I remember when I was 12, he took me into the kitchen and taught me how to grill a perfect steak. "The fire has to be just right, Wyatt," he said, adjusting the grill. "Too hot, it burns. Too cool, it's tough. Life's the same. You've got to find balance." I stood there, sweat beading on my forehead from the heat, but my heart swelled with pride. Those years passed like a dream. I grew up in his embrace, surrounded by the smell of grilled meat and the sound of waves from the Chesapeake Bay. I thought it would always be that way, that the restaurant would always be my haven, that my grandfather would always be there guiding me. But life is never that simple. When I was 19, my grandfather passed away. It was a fall morning with golden leaves blanketing the road to the restaurant. He left quietly in his sleep, leaving a void nothing could fill. I stood in front of the restaurant, staring at the sign bearing his name, the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar, feeling like the world had crumbled. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because I didn't know what to do with the pain. I just stood there, clutching the restaurant key he'd given me, as if holding it tight could keep him with me. After the funeral, my father, Frank, took over the restaurant. I hoped he'd carry on my grandfather's legacy, preserving the values he'd built. But I was wrong. My father wasn't like him. He saw the restaurant as a money-making machine, not a legacy. Within months, things changed. The farmer's market trip stopped. He started ordering frozen food from big suppliers, the kind my grandfather never trusted. "It's more efficient, Wyatt," he said when I asked. "We need to scale up, go bigger." I wanted to argue, to say my grandfather would never have agreed, but at 19 I was too young, too inexperienced to challenge him. The days that followed felt like being trapped in a slow-motion nightmare. The Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar, once the heart of my world, had become something unrecognizable. My father sat in a shiny new office with a polished wooden desk and revenue charts hanging on the walls. He no longer poured beers at the bar or checked ribs in the kitchen like my grandfather did. Instead, he made phone calls, held meetings, and signed contracts with suppliers I'd never heard of. "Frozen food from China, Wyatt," he said smugly. "Cheaper, faster delivery, and customers won't know the difference." I stood there, gripping the edge of the table, trying to swallow my anger. I wanted to shout that customers weren't fools, that they'd notice the difference, that my grandfather built this place on sincerity, not cheap shortcuts. But I stayed silent because I knew my father wouldn't listen. Each day I watched my grandfather's legacy being chipped away. The local farmers who once shook hands with my grandfather every morning stopped coming. Instead, cold delivery trucks parked behind the restaurant, unloading crates of frozen fish and packaged vegetables from thousands of miles away. I remember opening one crate and seeing gray, lifeless sardines with cloudy eyes, no trace of the freshness my grandfather always demanded. "This isn't what Grandpa would use," I muttered, but no one listened. The head chef, Henry, who'd worked with my grandfather from the beginning, just shook his head and sighed. "Times have changed, Wyatt," he said, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. Within 2 years of my father taking over, the restaurant's profits soared. He opened 3 new locations, one in Virginia Beach, one in Chesapeake, and one in Newport News. The local papers called it a resounding success. My father appeared on magazine covers, grinning smugly in tailored suits, spouting grandiose talk about his business vision. I read those articles, but every word felt like a knife. Success? This wasn't my grandfather's success. It was a betrayal. The local suppliers, the farmers my grandfather shook hands with every morning, were replaced by faceless corporations delivering frozen fish and packaged produce from halfway across the globe. I remember opening a crate once, the smell of plastic and chemicals hitting my nose. Those gray sardines, their dull eyes staring back, held no trace of life. "This isn't what Grandpa would use," I said again, but no one cared. While my father basked in the glow of his numbers, my twin brother Blake became his biggest fan. As twins, we shared the same dark brown hair and Dawson blue eyes, but our souls were worlds apart. While I grew up by my grandfather's side, learning to pick ripe tomatoes and grill a perfect steak, Blake was drawn to the same glitz and glamour that captivated our father. Now, seeing Dad splurge on luxury, Blake idolized him. He was enamored with the new cars, the lavish vacations, and the promises of a restaurant empire Dad painted. "Dad's a genius, Wyatt," Blake said one evening as we sat in the living room watching Dad show off his new yacht. "Grandpa worked his whole life for one little place. Dad's taking us to the next level." I looked at Blake, wanting to explain that Dad's next level was a castle built on sand, that Grandpa didn't just build a restaurant but a legacy. But Blake just laughed, shaking his head as if I were a dreamer who didn't understand business. Blake didn't just support Dad, he fawned over him. During family dinners, when my mother Laura tried to share stories about Grandpa to keep the warmth alive, Blake would interrupt, gushing about Dad's expansion plans. "Dad says we'll open a branch in Richmond, then DC," he'd say, eyes gleaming with excitement. "Don't you see, Wyatt? We're making history." I'd nod, choking down my food, the words stuck in my throat. History? The history Grandpa built was being erased, but Blake couldn't see it. He was mesmerized by the revenue numbers, by Dad's spotlight, by praise from people who knew nothing about the restaurant's true value. Meanwhile, my father grew increasingly arrogant. He began to belittle Grandpa, something I never thought he'd dare do. "Arthur was a good man, but he was outdated," he said during one dinner when I hesitantly suggested returning to local farmers. "His time is over, Wyatt. If we stuck to his ways, we'd still be a small-time joint in Norfolk." Blake laughed loudly, nodding as if Dad had said something profound. I sat there, hands clenched under the table, feeling the blood rush to my face. Outdated? Grandpa built a place people loved, a place they called home. And Dad? He was turning it into a soulless machine, stripped of the warmth of those old days. Dad's arrogance didn't stop at words. He started spending lavishly, as if the money would never run out. A sleek sports car appeared in front of the restaurant, followed by a vacation home in the Outer Banks. "This is what we deserve, Wyatt," he said, clapping my shoulder as if I agreed, but I couldn't. Every dollar he spent felt like another stab at Grandpa's legacy. I remembered Grandpa's words. "Do business with your heart, Wyatt. If you chase money alone, you'll lose everything." I wanted to scream that Dad was on the wrong path, that he was destroying everything Grandpa spent his life building. But I didn't have the courage. I was just a kid, barely learning the ropes of business. I had no power, no voice. Those days I felt like an outsider in my own family. I remember going into the kitchen once, helping Henry prepare dishes, trying to hold on to a sliver of the old days' flavor. But the ingredients made me sick. The frozen steaks would never have the sweet richness Grandpa took pride in. Once a regular customer, Margaret, who'd been coming since I was a kid, pulled me aside and asked, "Wyatt, why do the ribs taste different today? They're not like Arthur's." I could only apologize, feeling like I was betraying her, betraying Grandpa. I naively thought things could change when Blake and I graduated college. At 23, we returned to Norfolk with business administration degrees in hand, ready to contribute to the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar. I carried my grandfather's fire, a fierce belief that I could steer the restaurant back to its true path, one of sincerity, fresh ingredients, and relationships with local farmers. Blake, on the other hand, only wanted to chase our father's dream of expansion. He saw the new branches and profit numbers as the future. I saw a legacy eroding day by day. On my first day at the family company, I felt an unfamiliar atmosphere. The main office in Norfolk now resembled a sleek corporate headquarters with glass walls and glowing computer screens. My father sat at the head of the meeting table, dressed in a tailored suit, his gold watch gleaming, looking more like a tycoon than a restaurateur. Blake sat beside him, eagerly taking notes, nodding enthusiastically as Dad outlined plans for a new branch in Baltimore. I sat at the far end of the table, clutching my grandfather's old notebook, filled with his recipes and reminders to do business with heart. I had prepared a plan, a vision to return the restaurant to its roots. In that first meeting, I mustered all my courage to speak. "We should go back to working with local farmers," I said, my voice trembling but trying to sound confident. "Clean, traceable ingredients will build a sustainable brand. Customers don't just want good food, they want to know where it comes from." I glanced around the table, hoping for a flicker of agreement. Instead, I was met with awkward silence. My father raised an eyebrow, a smirk curling on his face. "Wyatt," he said, his voice slow but sharp as a blade, "you've spent too much time with your grandfather, haven't you? You're stuck in his old-fashioned, outdated ways." He paused, looking around the room as if addressing a crowd. "His time is over. We can't run a business by shopping at farmers' markets like housewives. We need scale, efficiency." A few employees chuckled, and I felt my face flush with heat. I wanted to stand up, to yell that he was wrong, that he was destroying everything Grandpa built. Blake, as usual, didn't miss a beat. "You're such a dreamer, Wyatt," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm and a mocking grin. "Clean food, local farmers? What century do you think we're in? Business is about being practical, not spinning fairy tales about Grandpa." The room erupted in laughter, and I felt myself shrinking, small and powerless. I stayed with the company, not because I wanted to, but because I felt I owed it to Grandpa. I couldn't let his legacy vanish entirely. In the months that followed, I kept raising ideas in meetings, though each one was shot down by Dad or mocked by Blake. "Wyatt, you need to think bigger," Dad said in another meeting when I suggested reducing reliance on frozen ingredients. "You can't keep clinging to Grandpa's slow ideas. Look at the revenue. We're breaking records." Blake clapped as if Dad had said something profound, but all I saw was a runaway train speeding toward a cliff. The tension didn't stay confined to the boardroom. It seeped into family dinners, holidays that once brought us together. One Sunday evening, as we gathered around the dinner table, Mom tried to share a story about the time Grandpa taught me to pick tomatoes at the farmer's market. Wyatt was only 8, but he learned so fast, she said, her smile warm. I smiled back, feeling a flicker of those old days' warmth. But Blake cut in, as if Mom's story was an insult. "Mom, enough with those stories," he snapped, his voice irritated. "We're talking about business, not fairy tales." My heart clenched, and I stood up to argue back. Things only got worse. Dad immediately tore into me, and Blake joined in, saying I wasn't worthy of the family legacy. My mother, Laura, was caught in the middle, powerless. She wanted the family to stay united, but she didn't know how. After tense dinners, she'd pull me aside, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Wyatt, be patient with your father and brother," she'd whisper. "They just want what's best for the family." I looked into her eyes, seeing her desperation, and knew she was hurting as much as I was. But I couldn't be patient. Every day I felt like I was losing Grandpa all over again, and I couldn't bear it. I started spending more time in Grandpa's old office, reading his notes, seeking strength from his teachings. "Do business with your heart, Wyatt," he wrote. I told myself I wouldn't give up. I'd stay. I'd fight to save his legacy, even if it meant facing Dad and Blake head-on. But deep down, I knew the road ahead would be treacherous. The family tension was rising like a storm on the horizon, and I, a young man fresh out of college, wasn't sure if I had the strength to weather it. In the years that followed, I fought to hold on to my conviction. 2 years after graduating, I was still working at the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar, though each day felt more like a battle. I continued to voice my ideas in meetings, still tried to convince Dad to return to local farmers, but every attempt was dismissed by him or mocked by Blake. "Wyatt, you need to grow up," Dad said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Business isn't a child's game." Blake smirked, calling me a dreamer stuck in the past. I swallowed their bitter words, telling myself I was doing this for Grandpa, for the values he'd passed down. But deep down, I was starting to feel exhausted. I didn't know how much longer I could endure. Then came Thanksgiving when I was 25. It was a cold day in Norfolk, with winds from the Chesapeake Bay carrying the salty scent and the crisp bite of autumn. My mother, Laura, had prepared a grand feast at the family home, the table draped in white silk and laden with traditional dishes: roast turkey, mashed sweet potatoes, and fragrant pumpkin pie. She always tried to make holidays like this warm and cozy, a way to bring the family closer, though both she and I knew the cracks between us had grown too deep. As I stepped into the dining room, the familiar smell of food sent a pang through my heart. I remembered Thanksgivings when Grandpa was alive. He'd sit at the head of the table, sharing stories of his early days, laughing heartily about the time he burned a batch of ribs because he was too busy chatting with customers. But now Dad sat in his place, dressed in an expensive suit, his gold watch glinting on his wrist. Blake sat beside him, buzzing with excitement like a kid, while Mom busied herself arranging plates, hiding her tension behind a strained smile. The atmosphere started out pleasant enough. Mom shared light-hearted stories about Blake's and my childhood, and I tried to laugh along, though my heart felt heavy. Dad and Blake talked about the company, the new Baltimore branch, and plans to expand into North Carolina. I stayed quiet, cutting my turkey, trying to suppress the simmering anger inside. I'd learned to hold my tongue over the years, but every word Dad spoke about his business vision felt like a knife to my heart. Then mid-meal, Dad stood, lightly tapping his wine glass to draw attention. "I have an important announcement," he said, his voice low but commanding. I looked up, a bad feeling settling in my gut. Mom stopped arranging plates, her eyes flickering with worry. Blake grinned as if he already knew what was coming. I gripped my knife and fork, waiting. "As you know, the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar is now an empire," Dad began, a smug smile spreading across his face. "And I've been thinking a lot about the future, about who will take over when I'm gone." He paused, scanning the table, his gaze lingering on Blake. My heart raced. I didn't know why, but I felt the ground shifting beneath me. "I've made my decision," Dad continued, his voice ringing like a verdict. "The entire estate and the restaurant chain will be left to Blake." The room seemed to freeze. My blood turned to ice, as if someone had doused me with cold water. Mom gasped, her trembling hand setting her glass down. Blake beamed, clapping as if he'd won a grand prize. "Thank you, Dad," he exclaimed, standing to hug him. But I sat there, stunned, feeling the world collapse around me. Dad raised a hand, silencing the room. "Let me explain," he said, his eyes sliding over me, cold and devoid of emotion. "Blake understands my vision. He knows how to do business, how to take the family enterprise to new heights. As for Wyatt," he paused, locking eyes with me, each word a dagger. "Wyatt only knows how to resist. He has no vision, no understanding of business. He clings to Grandpa's outdated ideas, but we're in a new era. I can't entrust this empire to someone who doesn't grasp its value." It felt like a slap in front of the entire family. Dad's words weren't just a decision, they were a betrayal. For 6 years since Grandpa's death, I'd poured myself into protecting his legacy. I'd worked in the restaurant, voiced ideas, endured Blake's mockery and Dad's contempt, all because I believed I could save what Grandpa left behind. And now, Dad wasn't just stripping me of my inheritance. He was dismissing every effort, every belief I held. Mom looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "Frank," she said, her voice shaking, "you can't do this to Wyatt. He's your son too." But Dad just shook his head. "Laura, this is for the family's good. Blake is our future." Blake, still grinning, patted my shoulder as if consoling me. "Don't be upset, Wyatt," he said, his voice sweet but laced with falseness. "You can still work for the company. You're just not cut out to lead." I looked into Blake's eyes, and for the first time I saw clearly that he wasn't just Dad's supporter. He was part of this betrayal. I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed my chair back and stood, the room spinning around me. "Wyatt, sit down," Mom called, her voice thick with worry. But I didn't listen. I couldn't stay there, couldn't sit at the same table with people who'd turned their backs on me, on Grandpa. "I don't belong here anymore," I said, my voice calm but cold as ice. I looked at Dad, then Blake, and finally at Mom, who was fighting back tears. "You've chosen your path. I won't walk it with you." I walked out of the dining room, each step tearing at my heart. Outside, the cold wind swept through, carrying dry leaves across the street. I stood in front of the house, looking back at the warm light spilling from the windows, but I knew I no longer belonged there. I'd tried, fought, and hoped I could save Grandpa's legacy. But now I saw clearly, the family business was no longer his. Dad and Blake had turned it into something foreign, a machine fueled by greed and arrogance. In that moment, I made a vow to myself. I wouldn't follow Dad's path, chasing numbers or hollow glory. I would rebuild from the ground up the way Grandpa taught me, with heart, with sincerity, with the values he instilled in me. I knew Dad's company would eventually crumble because anything built on deceit could never last. And I, Wyatt Dawson, would prove it. That night, I packed my things and left the house without a word to Dad or Blake. I took nothing but a few clothes, Grandpa's notebook, and the fire still smoldering in my heart. I had no money, no clear plan, only an ironclad resolve. I would start over my way. Standing in a tiny rented room in Norfolk, staring at a near-empty bank account, I realized the road ahead wasn't just treacherous, it was fraught with risk. I'd walked away from the family business, my inheritance, and the security I once had. But I had no regrets. I knew I was doing the right thing, even if the cost was steep. I began working to make my dream a reality, a small restaurant rooted in the farm-to-table philosophy Grandpa lived by. I wanted a place that used organic, traceable ingredients where customers could taste the heart in every dish. But dreaming was easy. Execution was the challenge. I had no capital, no connections, and worse, I knew Dad and Blake wouldn't leave me alone. I needed a partner, someone who believed in my vision. Then I thought of Brittany. Brittany had been my friend since high school, a girl with golden hair and a smile that lit up any room. She was a talented chef, trained at a prestigious culinary school and working at a small restaurant in Virginia Beach. I remembered the days we'd sit together in class, daydreaming about opening our own place. "Wyatt, if you do it, I'll be in the kitchen," she'd said, half joking. I called her, unsure if she'd remember that promise. When I shared my idea, Brittany didn't hesitate. "Wyatt, I believe in you," she said over the phone, her voice brimming with excitement. "Let's do this. I'm in." Brittany brought not just her culinary skills, but also the faith I desperately needed. We started planning a small restaurant in Norfolk named Arthur's Legacy Steakhouse to honor Grandpa. With a bank loan and Brittany's modest savings, we rented a small storefront in the old neighborhood, the heart of my childhood memories with Grandpa. Starting a business was never easy. We faced countless challenges from the outset. With limited funds, we could only afford basic equipment and a few months' rent. I reached out to local farmers who'd worked with Grandpa, but many were hesitant. "Wyatt, we love you," said Joe, the sweet potato farmer. "But your dad made things hard for us. He doesn't want us working with you." I wasn't surprised. Dad and Blake, with their vast network, did everything to obstruct me. They persuaded major suppliers to avoid us, spreading rumors that my restaurant would fail. Some days I stood in the empty kitchen of Arthur's Legacy, staring at nearly bare shelves, wondering if I was on the wrong path. But Brittany was there, a beacon in my darkest moments. She wasn't just a chef. She was a partner who reminded me why we started. "Wyatt, we're doing the right thing," she said one evening as we sat on the restaurant floor surrounded by freshly delivered crates. "Your grandpa would be proud." I looked into her eyes, saw her determination, and knew I couldn't give up. My mother, Laura, became my biggest supporter. She'd visit Arthur's Legacy on her days off, bringing homemade cookies or helping clean tables. "You're doing what your grandpa always wanted," she said, her eyes glistening. She never said it outright, but I knew she was heartbroken by the family divide. Dad and Blake acted as if I didn't exist. Yet Mom somehow found a way to stay close to me even if she couldn't change them. Slowly, Arthur's Legacy drew customers. We worked tirelessly, I at the front, Brittany in the kitchen, crafting dishes that echoed Grandpa's era. Perfectly grilled steaks, salads with fresh local produce, and fragrant toasted bread. Customers came out of curiosity but stayed for the quality. "This is the best ribs I've ever had," one said, warming my heart. Each compliment was a brick in our reputation. Regulars returned, bringing friends, and soon our little restaurant was packed on weekends. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Some nights I lay awake worrying about unpaid loans and Dad and Blake's relentless interference. A Chesapeake Bay fish supplier abruptly canceled our contract, admitting Dad had pressured them. "I'm sorry, Wyatt," he said. "Frank's a big player." I gripped the phone, wanting to scream, but I just nodded and found another way. Brittany and I drove hours to meet new suppliers, winning them over with sincerity and promises of long-term partnerships. Slowly, we built a small but reliable network of farmers and fishermen who stood by us. By the time I was 27, Arthur's legacy was standing strong. We not only paid down some debt but also turned a profit. Brittany and I grew closer than ever. One evening after closing, we sat on the restaurant steps sharing a beer and watching the streetlights flicker. "Wyatt," Brittany said softly, "you did it. We did it." I looked at her, and in that moment I knew she wasn't just a colleague but my partner in life. I took her hand, and soon after I proposed. Brittany said yes, her smile bright as the sun. Our wedding was on a warm spring day in a small Norfolk garden, simple with wildflowers and rustic wooden chairs. Mom attended, wearing a pale blue dress, hugging me tightly and saying, "Your grandpa would be so proud, Wyatt." Dad and Blake didn't show. I wasn't surprised, but it still stung. Brittany held my hand, whispering, "We're each other's family, Wyatt." And looking into her eyes, I knew she was right. Her family, our friends and Mom, made the day beautiful, though Dad and Blake's absence lingered like a small thorn in my heart. By 29, Arthur's legacy was a Norfolk staple with steady customers and glowing reviews on Yelp and in local papers. We paid off most of our debts and began planning a second location. I wanted to bring Grandpa's philosophy to more people, to prove that doing business with heart wasn't just a dream but a reality. Brittany and I scouted new spaces, discussed menus, and dreamed of a bigger future, always true to Grandpa's values. I knew challenges lay ahead. Dad and Blake remained a threat, and I couldn't predict their next move to undermine me. But every day as I walked into Arthur's legacy, saw Grandpa's photo on the wall and heard customers' laughter, I felt I was on the right path. I wasn't just building a restaurant, but a legacy. Grandpa's true legacy, not the one Dad and Blake had destroyed. And I knew, no matter what happened, I would never give up. In the years that followed, Arthur's Legacy Steakhouse became a small but shining beacon in Norfolk. Customers didn't just come to eat, they came for an experience, to feel the sincerity in every dish, from perfectly grilled steaks to salads made with vegetables picked that morning. But as Brittany and I poured ourselves into building our dream, whispers reached me about Dad's company. The Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar, once Grandpa's pride, was faltering. Customers began complaining about the food, rubbery steaks, off-tasting seafood, and bland salads that lacked soul. "I've eaten here since Arthur's days," a regular told Mom, his voice heavy with disappointment. "It's not the same anymore." Mom relayed the story to me, and I nodded, unsurprised. I'd seen this coming the day Dad chose to source frozen food from nameless suppliers. Rumors spread not just in the community but on food forums and social media. Yelp reviews called the chain's dishes cheap and heartless. Then one day, Mom called, her voice trembling with worry. "Wyatt, there's talk that the press is investigating your father's food sources," she said. "They're saying something shady about the seafood imported from China." I stayed silent, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to say Dad deserved it, that he dug his own grave by abandoning Grandpa's values. But another part, the small piece that still loved my family, ached. I didn't want Dad and Blake to crash, not entirely. Yet I knew they were on a path with no way out. Meanwhile, Arthur's legacy flourished. One morning, as I checked ingredients in the kitchen, a familiar face walked in. It was Henry, the head chef who'd worked with Grandpa from the start. He stood there in a worn jacket, his eyes tired but still warm with sincerity. "Wyatt," he said, his voice low, "I can't stay with your dad's company anymore. What he's doing, it's not what Arthur taught us." I looked at him, a wave of warmth spreading through me. "Want to work with me?" I asked almost instantly. Henry smiled and nodded. "I've been waiting for you to ask." Henry wasn't the only one. Other former employees of Grandpa's, Maria, the dishwasher, and Tom, who used to run the bar, started showing up at Arthur's legacy. They said they couldn't stand how Dad ran things, that they missed the days working with Grandpa when everyone was treated like family. "You're like Arthur, Wyatt," Maria said one night as we cleaned up after closing. "You've got his heart." Those words fueled me, strengthening my resolve to expand our dream. At 30, Brittany and I opened the second Arthur's Legacy in Virginia Beach. It was a bold move, funded by the first restaurant's slim profits and a new loan. But we'd prepared meticulously, from choosing a seaside location to signing contracts with local farmers and fishermen. On opening day, I stood outside watching a long line of customers filled with indescribable pride. Brittany stood beside me, holding my hand, whispering, "We did it, Wyatt." I looked at her, her smile radiant as sunlight, and knew I had not just a partner but an irreplaceable companion. The second restaurant quickly thrived. Customers loved the cozy atmosphere, the simple yet high-quality menu, and the story behind Arthur's legacy, a young man's quest to preserve his grandfather's legacy. Yelp and TripAdvisor reviews overflowed with praise. "This place feels like home," one wrote. "The food isn't just delicious, it has soul." Each compliment was a brick in our reputation, and I knew Grandpa was smiling from somewhere above. A year later, at 31, we opened 2 more locations, one in Chesapeake, one in Richmond. With each new branch, I hung Grandpa's photo in the dining room, a reminder of why we started. Brittany and I worked tirelessly, from inspecting ingredients to training staff, ensuring every restaurant embodied Grandpa's spirit, sincerity, quality, and warmth. Some nights, exhausted, I'd sit in the original restaurant's small office, staring at Grandpa's notebook, wondering if I was doing enough. But then I'd recall his words, "Do business with your heart, Wyatt." And I knew I was on the right path. As Arthur's legacy grew, Dad's company plunged into crisis. Mom would visit, sharing updates over coffee after closing. "They're panicking," she said once. "The press is digging deeper into the food sourcing and customers are leaving." She said Dad hired a PR team to quash the rumors, but it only worsened. A Norfolk Chronicle article questioned the chain's transparency, and customers began boycotting. Blake, with blind confidence, insisted it was a misunderstanding, but I knew the truth. Dad and Blake had built their empire on deceit, and now it was crumbling. Mom looked at me, her eyes gleaming with pride and a touch of sadness. "You've done what your father couldn't, Wyatt," she said, squeezing my hand. "You've kept your grandpa's heart alive." I smiled, but a void lingered. I didn't want Dad and Blake to fail, not exactly. But they'd chosen their path, and I couldn't save them. I could only keep building Arthur's legacy, not just for myself, but for Grandpa, for Mom, and for those who believed in me. Each evening, as I locked the restaurant and watched the streetlights flicker, a strange peace settled over me. I was facing Dad and Blake, not with hatred, but by living true to my beliefs. Arthur's legacy wasn't just a restaurant chain. It was proof that doing business with heart is never outdated. And I knew whatever the future held, I'd keep fighting, not to prove Dad wrong, but to prove Grandpa right. One early summer morning when I was 32, as I checked ingredients at the Norfolk restaurant, Brittany walked in holding a local newspaper, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Wyatt, you need to read this," she said, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. She handed me the Virginia Times, and the headline on the food section made my heart race. "Arthur's Legacy and the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar. 2 paths, 1 legacy." The article was written by Eleanor Price, a renowned food critic whose words could make or break a restaurant. I took the paper, my hands trembling, unsure if this was good or bad news. I sat at the bar, reading each line with my heart pounding. Eleanor wrote about the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar with unflinching honesty. She described how the food quality had plummeted: tough steaks, off-smelling seafood, and service as cold as the frozen ingredients they use. She questioned the sourcing, mentioning rumors of low-quality imports from China and unknown suppliers. "Customers have lost trust," she wrote, "and it's no surprise when a legacy built on sincerity has been reduced to a money-making machine." Then she turned to Arthur's legacy. Reading those words, I felt my heart melt. "Wyatt Dawson, Arthur Dawson's grandson, has brought his grandfather's spirit back to life," she wrote. "Arthur's Legacy Steakhouse is a testament to doing business with heart. Fresh ingredients from local farmers, transparent sourcing, and a warm atmosphere that feels like dining at home. Wyatt has revived his grandfather's legacy, not by chasing profits, but by honoring the values that once made the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar a beloved name." I folded the paper, a mix of emotions surging within: pride, gratitude, but also a pang of sorrow. Eleanor's article didn't just praise us. It drew a stark contrast between Arthur's legacy and Dad's company. It was a declaration that I'd been right, that Grandpa's path was the sustainable one. Brittany hugged me, her smile radiant. "We did it, Wyatt," she said. "This is a game changer." And it was. Eleanor's article spread like wildfire. Social media buzzed with comments from Grandpa's old customers to newcomers discovering Arthur's legacy. They shared the article, posted photos of our dishes, and praised the sincerity in every detail. Customers flocked to all three locations: Norfolk, Virginia Beach, and Richmond. Some days we had to turn people away for lack of tables, and I hired more staff to keep up. Henry, now head chef at the Norfolk branch, laughed heartily at the crowds. "See this, Wyatt? This is what Arthur always wanted." Meanwhile, the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar's sales plummeted. Mom said Dad and Blake had to close the Chesapeake branch due to dwindling customers. Rumors about poor food quality spread, and then the worst happened. A group of customers claimed they got sick after eating at the Newport News branch. They posted online describing nausea and stomach pain, demanding answers. Some even banded together to file a lawsuit, accusing the chain of using unsafe, low-quality ingredients. I heard this from Mom, and though I didn't want Dad and Blake to crash, I couldn't deny they'd brought this on themselves. Each day, Arthur's legacy welcomed more customers, while the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar lost its shine. I knew Eleanor's article was just the spark. The truth about Dad's practices had exposed itself. But I didn't feel triumphant. Instead, a vague sadness lingered. I'd once hoped to save the family business, but now I knew it had strayed too far from Grandpa's path. The collapse of the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar came faster than I expected. Not long after Eleanor's article, the Virginia Food Safety Agency launched an investigation. They inspected the chain's remaining locations, and what they found shocked even me. Substandard ingredients, falsified documents about food origins, and even sanitation violations in the kitchens. A public report revealed that much of the seafood imported from China failed safety standards, with some certifications forged to pass inspections. I read the report online, torn between anger and heartache. This was the company Grandpa spent his life building, now tarnished by Dad's greed. The consequences hit like a storm. The Food Safety Agency revoked the operating licenses of the Baltimore and Richmond branches. Customers boycotted in droves, refusing to step foot in the remaining locations. Shareholders, who once praised Dad's vision, fled, pulling their investments as quickly as they'd poured them in. Articles kept coming, each one a final blow to Dad's empire. "From legacy to disaster," one headline read. I read it with a heavy heart. I didn't want this to happen, but I knew I couldn't stop it. Meanwhile, Arthur's legacy soared. Investors started reaching out, offering capital to open more locations. "You've got a sustainable model, Wyatt," one said during a meeting at the Norfolk restaurant. The market craves brands like yours, quality, ethical, with a story. I listened but remained cautious. I didn't want Arthur's legacy to become a machine like Dad's company. I agreed to meetings but always stressed that any expansion had to stay true to Grandpa's farm-to-table philosophy. Amid the chaos, I got a call from Dad. I was in the Virginia Beach restaurant's kitchen checking a fresh batch of fish when my phone buzzed. Seeing his name, I hesitated. I didn't want to hear him, but curiosity won out. "Wyatt," his voice came through, hoarse and laced with anger. "What have you done? You've destroyed this family." I was stunned, unable to believe what I'd heard. "What are you talking about?" I replied, trying to stay calm. "You turned the press against us," he shouted. "You built that restaurant to compete, to prove me wrong. You betrayed the family." I gripped the phone, my blood boiling. "Dad," I said, my voice icy, "you betrayed Grandpa. I'm just doing what he taught me." I hung up, my heart pounding, but I knew I wasn't wrong. A few days later, Blake called. His voice trembled, stripped of the old confidence. "Wyatt, you have to help us," he said, almost pleading. "The company's collapsing. Dad doesn't know what to do, and I can't handle it." I stayed silent, letting him continue. "You know how to fix this, Wyatt. You can save the company, please." I heard the panic in his voice, and for the first time I saw his incompetence clearly. All those years of fawning over Dad, all that arrogance now reduced to desperation. "Blake," I said evenly, "I tried to save the company long ago. You didn't listen. It's too late now." I hung up, feeling a strange relief. I was no longer responsible for them. Arthur's legacy kept growing, but I didn't let success blind me. Brittany and I worked tirelessly to ensure every location maintained Grandpa's quality and spirit. Mom, witnessing both Dad's downfall and my rise, often said, "You're my pride, Wyatt." I knew she was still heartbroken over the family's fracture, but she saw I'd kept my promise to Grandpa. I wasn't fighting to tear down Dad or Blake, but to prove that doing business with heart was the right path. The path Grandpa walked and the one I'd continue. A few months after Blake's call, as I was busy preparing for a packed evening at the Norfolk branch, Mom called. "Wyatt," she said, her voice trembling, "your father and Blake want to meet you." I froze, the knife in my hand still mid-chop, a chill running down my spine. I didn't want to see them, not after everything, but Mom pleaded. "They're desperate, Wyatt. Just meet them once, please." I sighed, knowing I couldn't refuse her. "Fine," I said, "but I'm not promising anything." The meeting took place on a drizzly afternoon at a small coffee shop in downtown Norfolk. I walked in and saw Dad and Blake in the corner, a far cry from their days of arrogance. Dad, once always in tailored suits and a gold watch, now wore a worn sweater, his face haggard, eyes sunken. Blake sat beside him, hair disheveled, avoiding my gaze. I sat across from them, silent, waiting for them to speak. "Wyatt," Dad began, his voice hoarse, stripped of its old smugness. "The company's on the brink of bankruptcy. We've lost most of our locations. Shareholders don't trust us anymore, and the lawsuits, they're killing us." He paused, looking at me as if expecting a reaction. I stayed silent, hands clasped tightly under the table. Blake jumped in, his voice almost pleading. "Wyatt, you can help us. Arthur's legacy is thriving. You could buy the company or loan us enough to recover. This is the family legacy. You can't let it collapse." I looked at Blake, seeing desperation in his eyes, but also emptiness. He didn't understand, or refused to, that Grandpa's true legacy had died long ago, the day Dad chose profits over heart. I took a deep breath, meeting Dad's eyes, then Blake's. "That's not Grandpa's legacy anymore," I said, my voice cold but steady. "You destroyed it. You chose your path, and this is the consequence." Dad's brow furrowed as if he couldn't believe my words. "Wyatt, you're my son," he said, his voice shaking with anger and desperation. "You can't turn your back on family like this." "Family," I repeated, feeling the simmering anger flare. "You turned your back on me the day you chose Blake as heir. You turned your back on Grandpa the day you bought cheap ingredients for profit. Don't talk to me about family. I stood, my heart heavy yet relieved. I can't help you. Not because I don't want to, but because I can't save something that's already dead. Blake broke down, sobbing, but I didn't look back. I walked out of the coffee shop, the cold rain hitting my face, but I felt as if a weight had lifted. I'd held my ground, not out of hatred, but because I couldn't live in the shadow of a family that betrayed its own values. Back at Arthur's Legacy, Brittany was waiting at the door. She didn't ask questions, just hugged me, and in her embrace I knew I'd made the right choice. A year later, the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar officially declared bankruptcy. The news spread across papers from the Norfolk Chronicle to the Virginia Times. Restaurant empire falls to greed, one headline read. Dad and Blake were drowning in debt. They were forced to sell their once prized luxuries. The Outer Banks vacation home, the lavish yacht, the sleek sports cars. Mom said Dad now lived in a small apartment on the outskirts while Blake took odd jobs to get by. I listened without feeling triumph, only a vague sadness. They were my family, however distant, and I never wanted to see them in this state, but I knew they'd chosen their path. Mom, unwilling to live in Dad's shadow any longer, moved in with Brittany and me. We had a daughter, Emma, and Mom became a wonderful grandmother, always telling Emma about her great-grandfather Arthur and the golden days of the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar. Your great-grandpa was a remarkable man, she'd say, stroking Emma's hair. And your dad is carrying on his legacy. Those words warmed my heart. I wasn't doing this just for Grandpa, but for Mom, Brittany, and Emma, my true family. Arthur's legacy kept growing, but Brittany and I stayed vigilant. We opened 2 more locations, one in DC and one in Raleigh, always ensuring each remained true to Grandpa's farm-to-table philosophy. I still visited farmers' markets myself, shaking hands with growers, listening to their stories about crops and families. I wanted Arthur's Legacy to be more than a restaurant chain, a community where customers and staff felt at home. In every location, I hung a photo of Grandpa standing in front of the original Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar, his smile radiant and eyes full of resolve. It was a symbol of the true legacy, not money or fame, but sincerity and integrity. One evening, as I stood in the Norfolk branch's kitchen watching customers laugh and talk outside, I felt a rare moment of peace. Brittany came up, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You okay, Wyatt?" she asked softly. I smiled, glancing at Grandpa's photo on the wall. "I'm good," I said. "I was just thinking, I kept my promise to Grandpa." My smile wasn't about outdoing Dad or Blake, or about Arthur's legacy thriving while the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar fell. It was a smile of liberation, freedom from a toxic family, from values I was once pressured to follow. I'd found my path, not just to prove Grandpa right, but to live true to myself. And as I looked out, seeing the streetlights glimmer and hearing laughter from the dining room, I knew Grandpa's legacy would live on, not just in Arthur's legacy, but in my heart and in the generations to come.